So we are recording the interview of Danita Nordlund. This interview is being conducted by David Morse from Wright State University's Veteran Voices Project. This interview is being recorded at Wright State University's new media incubator in Dayton, Ohio. It is 10:20 a.m., March 11th, 2017. All right, Danita, let's start with when and where you were born.
I was born in Wilmington, North Carolina, January 30th of 71.
71, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Who are your parents?
My mother's name is Danita, and she comes from Spain. And my father's name, my biological father's name is Brant. He's from New York. And then my stepfather is from Boston. His name is William.
Okay. And what were their occupations?
My mother was a stay-at-home mom, and both my father and my stepfather were active duty Air Force.
Oh, wow. That's very cool.
Mm-hmm.
Did that have some sort of influence as to why you joined?
My biological father retired about the time when I was 5, so I really don't remember him serving.
Okay.
But my stepfather is the most influential person in my life, and that definitely had an impact on me, on my decision to join the Air Force.
Yeah.
Yeah. I decided when I was about 14 that I would join one day. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Do you have any other siblings?
I do. I have 5 sisters and 1 brother. Okay. And my brother's retired Air Force, and then my sister, one of my older sisters, her husband is retired Air Force, and one of my younger sisters served for 10 years, and her husband is still in the military also
Wow.
in the Air Force. Yeah.
That's
so
awesome.
Big Air Force family.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
It's incredible. It's kind of like my lineage. My grandfather was in the Air Force. My father was in the Air Force. I was in the Air Force. So, I mean, not as thick as yours, but I mean, it's nice to hear that.
Mm-hmm.
So what were you doing? I mean, I know you decided that you were going to be in the Air Force at the age of 14. Did you join right after high school, or? I
didn't. So I tried to make it out there in the world for a couple of years. I didn't join until I was almost 21. I turned 21 the day after basic training. But I was working retail. I worked in a hospital. I worked in a grocery store. There was a time where I was working about 4 different jobs, but still wasn't able to make it. Didn't have benefits. Didn't have any health benefits, and nobody in my family, excuse me, had ever gone to college, so I didn't really see that as a place where I was going, but I wanted to. So yeah, eventually it got to the point where it's like, okay, it's time to go ahead and do what I knew I wanted to do.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So what time frame was this? You said it was around 20 you joined? You were 20 years old?
20. So this was 1990.
1990.
So
okay.
when I went to see the recruiter, there was actually a freeze on Air Force recruiting.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't bringing anybody in. So I actually went and signed up to join the Army. But I was heartbroken. And every time I went into the recruitment center to talk to my Army recruiter, I would see the Air Force symbol, and I knew that it was a huge mistake. So one day I caught the Air Force recruiter in the office because he wasn't there very often, and I said, listen, this is what I've done, but this isn't what I want to do. And he said, hold on and wait. And so when the Air Force started recruiting again, I went to see him, and he spoke with the Army recruiter, and we got me switched over.
Wow.
Yeah, thankfully.
Awesome. Yeah.
No offense.
No, right.
But
no,
I knew where I wanted to be.
That's awesome.
And I also got the job that I had requested, so that was pretty incredible.
And what was that?
I was a linguist. I was a Spanish linguist. I went to the Defense Language Institute for Spanish, and I had lived in Spain as a dependent. My mother is from Spain, so being a Spanish linguist was an incredible opportunity.
Yeah.
Not just the school, but then the job that I did, which I can't really go into, but it was a whole lot of rewind, play, and typing, transcribing.
Okay.
And telework. Yeah.
That's great.
It was fantastic.
How did your family feel about you joining the Air Force?
Oh, they were totally supportive.
Yeah.
100%.
That's
They were
great.
just kind of waiting for me. They knew for many years that I wanted to, so it was a great thing.
Good. So let's talk about basic training.
Sure.
How was how was your basic training? Where did you go?
I went to Lackland,
Lackland.
so everybody goes to Lackland for Air Force basic training. And I went during the winter months. I was there over Christmas and New Year's. And, you know, a lot of people like basic training. I have to tell, I learned what I needed to know, the stuff that I didn't know about, you know, being true Air Force. So you learn the saluting and the marching and the history and the basics. But I was done before it was over. I was like, okay, I got it, I'm good. And so I thought that a lot of the yelling was was silly. So it was good. It was good. I got out of it what I needed to get out of it, but I was ready to go before it was done.
Right.
Yeah. And I knew, you know, there were a lot of women and men there that thought that that was what the military was all about. So I spent a lot of time explaining to people, this isn't really what it's like. Just get through this. Tech school is going to be fantastic, and you'll see the Air Force is wonderful.
Yeah. Where did you go from there?
I went to the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, which was paradise. We flew into San Francisco, and then from San Francisco, we took a small propeller plane, and once we broke through the clouds and I could see Monterey Bay, where we were going to be, I remember saying, oh, thank you, God. Yeah, and it was fantastic. It was fabulous. I remember the first morning after getting there, going into the dining hall, and there were people from all the different branches of services, because it's all joint service, and even FBI and different civilian agencies there, and people were sitting at tables and speaking all of these different foreign languages. You were hearing Persian Farsi at one table, you were hearing Mandarin Chinese at another table, and French and Portuguese, and you name the language.
Wow.
Just all these different languages, and me having grown up a dependent Air Force brat, moving to different countries, it just felt like I was home. You know, being around all these different languages and exposure to different cultures. So I loved it.
Yeah.
I wished that I had gotten to be in a program where I could be there longer, because Spanish was just a 6-month program, but then Spanish was what I wanted, so yeah. It was great.
Good. Do you you remember any of your instructors, whether it be in basic or
Oh,
tech school?
absolutely, because we had instructors from different Spanish-speaking countries. So I had 2 instructors from Cuba that they were fascinating. They had so many different stories about Castro. One of them in particular had worked alongside Castro, so he had some really great stories. And then my favorite instructor was from Argentina. I just loved the sound of his accent. And then we had an amazing instructor from Portugal. He spoke 7 different languages, and his English was impeccable. We had this wonderful lady from Colombia, and when she would speak Spanish, it almost sounded like she was singing. Yeah, and then a former soldier, a soldier from Guatemala, and he was missing part of his leg and one eye from combat, and he was fascinating, fascinating individual. Yeah, I remember all of them. But I only stayed in that career field for 5 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was in San Antonio, Texas, so after Monterey, it was right back to Lackland. And I was there for 5 years as a linguist, cross-trained out of that because I wanted to leave Texas. If I would have stayed in that career field, it would have been 20 years in San Antonio, and I wanted to see more of the world. I wanted to travel, and I wanted a more steady schedule, because as a linguist, you work a lot of shift work, and I was starting a family, and wanted something a little bit more Monday through Friday, you know, regular office hours. So I cross-trained into contracting, which is basically buying, it's purchasing. And I thought that they would move me, but they didn't. They just actually moved me from Kelly in San Antonio to Lackland in San Antonio. So I stayed there for another 2.5 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Was it a hard transition to go from linguist to contract?
It was.
Yeah.
Because being a linguist was exciting, and it was quite interesting, working, counter-narcotics missions and guerrilla warfare missions, and then now I'm buying equipment for civil engineers. And so, oh, I went from really cool stuff working, with NSA to now I'm buying wrenches. Okay. It was deflating. Aw. It did get more interesting, through the years, but yeah, it was a little bit difficult.
Okay.
But I did like the Monday through Friday kind of schedule, and I had a child shortly after getting into contracting, so that worked out well, and I was able to go to school and get my degree.
Good.
Because I had a more regular schedule.
And what was your degree in?
Business management. Mm-hmm.
Good.
Yep.
So then, where did you go from there at that point?
So from there, I went to Andrews Air Force Base in D.C. That was a pretty cool mission. I purchased a lot for Air Force One, and for Air Force Two, and everything that supported the presidential mission at Andrews, and did some construction projects there. And then that's where I completed my degree and applied for a commission and was accepted. And so I left Andrews and I went to officer training school.
Wow.
Down in Alabama.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And became, because I was a certified linguist and a certified contracting specialist, the Air Force said, okay, we'll go ahead and make you a logistics readiness officer. So I had to learn a brand new career at that point.
Yeah.
I moved to, and I'd already done one deployment also. I'd already done my very first deployment as a contracting specialist to Al Jaber Air Base in Kuwait. That was before I got my commission. So anyway, Al Jaber, back to Andrews, and then I ended up a logistics officer at Shaw Air Force Base, where we had 3 fighter squadrons, and being a loggy with 3 fighter squadrons was one hell of a job.
Wow. All right, I want to back up a little bit here.
Sure.
So let's talk about your family again real quick. Sure. You've gotten your education, you're commissioned to be an officer. What does your family feel about all this? I mean, you're stepping into, your first generation into college, right? Getting a college degree. You're now going to officer. What was your family's thoughts about this?
Wow, Danita, full steam ahead. My brother was still in the Air Force at the time, and he was working on his degree as well, so he actually got his a little bit before me. Not that it was a race, but thankfully, for he and I both, the Air Force was the way for us to go to college and get our degrees and progress in our careers. The officer thing was really new for the family. We'd all of us had been enlisted, and I was torn because I was accepted to OTS at the same time that I was accepted to go and work for one of the teams in Washington, D.C. that would travel with the president to purchase for that traveling mission. So there were actually 3 opportunities that were presented to me at the same time. One was OTS, the other one was that career, and then I was being offered a contracting position in Morone, Spain. So all 3 of those at one time, and I had to do a lot of thinking about that and talking to my dad about that. I always wanted to be a first sergeant. That's what he was. I wanted the diamond on my sleeve. So if I went officer, that dream would kind of go out the window. But at the same time, I was separating from my first husband, unfortunately, and needed to think about supporting myself, my career, and my son. So ultimately, going the path of OTS, because I knew I was going to stay in the Air Force until I retired, was the best decision for me and for my son.
That's good.
Yeah, so again, family completely supportive, and a lot of them traveled to my OTS graduation. Yeah.
That's a lot to think about.
It was,
yeah.
yeah.
Talk about your first deployment.
Yes.
It was to Kuwait,
It was.
right? What was that like?
It was great. It was, so back at that time, they were still just doing very short deployments for the Air Force. So it was 3 months. That's it. And it was good. It was an Air Force deployment. It was the only deployment that I did that was just for the Air Force. And I bought really cool things while I was out there, to be honest with you. I did some small, minor construction projects, like parking spots for fighter aircraft. That was one of the construction projects I had. But other than that, I was buying equipment for volleyball pits. I was buying really great things for services so that when people weren't working, they would have fun things to do. Equipment for the pool, equipment for the gym. I taught step aerobics while I was there. We worked long hours. We did a lot of purchasing. You know, any deployment is high stress when it comes to the workload. There's a lot more requirements than there are people there to work on those requirements. But we get it done, and we prioritize what needs to be bought, and we get that done. The hardest part about being deployed sorry.
Oh, that's fine. You're good.
Always the hardest part was leaving my son.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, a happier moment.
Sure.
The deployment itself was fine. We weren't, under, there was no combat in Kuwait.
Mm-hmm.
So the best part about the deployment, besides meeting great people over there, I can just still picture it, was coming home. And my sister at the time, her husband was stationed at Andrews, and she lived 3 doors down from me on base housing. And she ran a home daycare. And thankfully, my son was able to go there until he started kindergarten. And I just remember getting home and dropping my bags at the door, and running as fast as I could 3 doors down to my sister's, and busting through her door. And she's like, shh, shh, shh. I had called her from the airport. She knew that I was coming. And all the kids were on their mats sleeping. And it had only been 3 months. But my son looked so much bigger. And I just grabbed him. He was sleeping. I just grabbed him up off of his mat, held him in my arms, walked back to my house on base, and laid down with him on the couch until he woke up and just looked at his face. And when he opened his eyes and he's like, "Mommy," and yeah, it was wonderful. So
Sure.
I'm sorry.
No.
It was an awful long time ago. He's 19 now, and
Yeah.
he was just 3 at the time. It was a long time ago, but those memories are still so fresh. So always the hardest part was saying bye to him.
Sure.
And reuniting with him was just amazing. Yeah. Whew.
So you're get done with OTS,
Yes.
right? Your first duty from there
Was
after
Shaw
OTS?
Air Force Base,
Shaw Air Force
South
Base.
Carolina.
Okay, and you're now in logistics.
Yes.
Okay. And what is your primary job?
So I started off working in mobility bags. So in that office or in that warehouse, I should say, we're putting mobility bags together for people who deploy and for exercises. So gas masks, chemical suits, making sure that they're all good to go and assigned to every person that's at Shaw. We did a lot of exercises at that base, practicing for wartime. It was challenging, challenging. And I think a big part of the challenge for me was that when I switched over to being commissioned, I was a tech sergeant at that time. So to go from being really skilled in your profession as a contracting specialist to being a logistics readiness officer, I'm learning from airmen again, because I don't know anything about supply or fuels or there are 4 different career fields that were wrapped up into logistics, and I didn't know much about any of them. And they throw you into the job before they train you. So you're already, there I was sitting at Mobags, not knowing what I'm doing at all, trying to lead, and haven't been trained yet. So I was in that job for 6 months before they sent me to tech school. And I quickly learned that it wasn't really what I wanted to do. And then I became one of the alternate installation deployment officers. So we were deploying the fighter squadrons. And it wasn't too long before I was standing up in front of the entire leadership at Shaw doing sorts reporting, status. I don't want to bore you, but wartime readiness reserve statuses. And I got to know the contracting commander at Shaw, and he asked me, well, what did you do when you were enlisted? And when I told him, oh, I'm a level 2 contracting specialist, he's like, what are you doing in logistics? I'm like, riddle me that, Batman, I have no idea. So between him and the logistics commander, they got together and they helped me to get back into contracting. And can we break for a second? I need a tissue.
All right, so this is David Morse interviewing Danita Nordlund. We're coming back from a small break. We're picking up, you were talking about your job as a logistics officer. And let's start back where you're at Shaw Air Force Base.
So I'm at Shaw, and I've been there about 2 years as a logistics readiness officer, and I get to know the contracting commander who works with the logistics commander to get me cross-trained back into contracting. So I'm like, I'm home in contracting now. And they immediately deploy me. So I go back to Kuwait, and this was with the Army this time, and it was a good deployment. This one's only 4 months long. Again, we haven't gotten into the longer deployments yet. And I'm over at Camp Arif John, not Camp Arif John. It's near Doha, and the place is skipping my brain right now. No, it is. It's Camp Arif John, because I was at Al Jaber Air Base, the first one, Camp Arif John. Okay. And we're supporting 7 forward operating bases. And it's just myself and another Air Force captain. And the Air Force at that time, I'm pretty sure it's different now, but at that time, the Air Force is getting the best training in contracting. And the Army, for their enlisted force, and even for their officers, they're just not getting the level of training in contracting. So they're really, I remember the first day that I was there, I met with a major and lieutenant colonel, and they're like, we really depend on you, Air Force, to get our purchasing done.
This is from the Army?
This is from the Army, my Army leadership there. And I'm like, oh, okay, all right, so let's do this. They're like, you know, PD2, that's the system that, and I'm like, yeah, I'm familiar with ConWrite and PD2, the 2 contract writing systems. I get into the office, and my other Air Force counterparts like, hold on to your seat, because you have no idea what you're in for. I sit down and power up the system, and all of a sudden my inbox is just slammed full. And I'm like immediately overwhelmed. Like, okay, here we go. And it just so happened that the other captain is quite meticulous and a perfectionist as well. So for that entire deployment, we were busy. And we were overloaded. It was the first time in my life that I ever had to go to mental health and get a little bit of help, because I was at night pacing my room thinking about contract line item structure and my strategies for how I was going to get this stuff bought as quickly as we needed it to get bought. And there were some terrible things that were happening out of the gates at these forward operating bases. I was trying to get some tents built, and there was an entire labor force that was getting a lot of these tents built, that they were coming in on buses in the morning, and one of the buses was hit. They were bombed, and everybody on that bus passed away. And we still had to get these tents up, and I actually had to terminate that contract for default, which is a bad thing for a contractor. And that just, it broke my heart. I had to get that contract re-awarded to somebody else. And I just thought about all of the families of all of the men that were now, you know, those men were now gone.
Those were our guys?
No, they were local nationals.
Local, okay.
And third country nationals that were brought in from different countries that had passed. And then there was another time that somebody was clearing fields with shovels, and a bomb went off. And so lives lost there. And we actually heard that happen, and it had to do with another contract that I had out there. And sometimes I just sat there in the office and just wondered, what are we doing here? Why? What are we accomplishing? Are we accomplishing anything at this point? Because this was 2007. So really I just focused on what was on my plate. What did I need to get done to support our U.S. forces and the friendly forces that were working with us? What could I do to help them to make their lives better so that they could do their jobs? And that deployment was over seemingly before it even began. And then when I got back, I transferred from Shaw Air Force Base to Boston and got to sit in a seat for about a year before they deployed me again.
Wow.
So I went from doing base level contracting to now I'm doing systems level contracting. So it's on a much bigger scale. We're talking $1 million contracts. And set up in Boston for about a year before they deployed me to what I consider my first real deployment.
The so you did 2 deployments.
Yes,
in
at this point
Kuwait.
I've done 2.
At this point, the most difficult. What was the most challenging part about the deployments themselves for Kuwait specifically?
Workload.
Workload.
As far as being over there, okay, being away from the family,
Sure.
And then the changes that happen inside of you. and I told people all along the way that were going on their first deployment to be prepared, that nobody comes back from a deployment the same person. You just don't. It changes your perspective. After my first deployment, I ended up getting a divorce. And then as we talk further, I can tell you a little bit more about more things like that happened along the way.
Okay.
But yeah, so the workload and then the changes that you experience in yourself, how it affects you, how it changes you. The next deployments, because I had 3 more, those had a larger impact. Those had more challenges.
Sure. Do you feel like any of your first deployments in Kuwait helped prepare you at all for the deployments?
Yes, they did.
Okay.
I'm glad that honestly, that it was an escalation. Every deployment, so the very first one was kind of a fun one, other than the leaving the family part. The next one was more challenging, workload. And then the next one was the one where I felt the danger on top of the workload, on top of tremendous amount of family changes. So, yeah.
All right, so let's move on into
Sure.
your next stage of your career.
Sure.
So you've just now moved into you said Boston?
Yes. I'm at Hanscom Air Force Base, and this is kind of executive level contracting. So I'm doing communications, like theater-wide, like worldwide communication contracts. And just having a tiny little piece of it, because these are, again, just incredible. It's systems level, it's not base level. Anybody who knows contracting knows that they're two completely different animals. And so I'm just getting my feet wet in systems level contracting, and it's a bit overwhelming. So getting a tasking to go on a deployment was like, whew, I can go do something that I actually know, what I'm doing. But it's to Iraq this time. And it's 2008, and Iraq is still scary at this point. So this time I'm deploying with a weapon, with two, actually. I have my M16 and my M9. And I'm going into Baghdad. So I'm going right into the green zone. And I left on Halloween Day. My son was in full costume when I said bye to him. I can still see the doors closing at the elevator at the airport as I'm leaving. And I remember he didn't cry. And I think, okay, he's getting tough about this now. He understands. And then I find out later from his father that actually he did cry, but it was after the doors had closed. So maybe he just didn't want to cry in front of me. I get to Iraq November 2nd, 2008, and November 5th of 2008 was the first time we had to duck and cover. And that was a first for me. We got bombed that day. So I was underneath my desk in full battle rattle with helmet on, vest on, phone receiver under, like this, because we had access to stateside. We could call direct. So I was on the phone with family underneath the desk, terrified. And I could see feet underneath the desks behind me, and right behind me was big feet, size 13. A man that I would, after that deployment, about a year after that deployment, end up marrying. So when they called the all clear, he comes walking around to the other side and starts laughing at me because I'm still shaking. And he says, why are you so scared? I'm like, I don't want to die. I want to go home one day. And I remember he said, hey, if the big man calls you to the office, it's your time to go. Don't be afraid. And I'm like, oh, you're a Christian. He's like, yes, I am. And love bloomed. But that deployment was a bit over 6 months. I was doing construction contracts, so building police stations, hospitals, dormitories. A lot of work, but we had a lot of labor there. A lot of forces doing the purchasing, so a lot of camaraderie. It was a great deployment, but again, changed me, changed my life, changed my son's life. Came back from that deployment, and it was another. It was a year later that I remarried and moved. So that remarriage caused a move, a lot of changes.
The deployment itself.
Yes.
So this is your third deployment now.
Yes.
So your son was starting to get to the point where he was almost, I guess, getting kind of used to it at this point.
He was 11.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You were staying in communication because you had a phone.
Yes.
That you could communicate back to them.
Yes.
How frequently were you staying in contact with your family while in deployment?
I called my son probably every 2 to 3 days, if not more often.
Okay. That
And started, I think it was on that deployment that we started Skype. No, it was just phone calls at this point. And it was difficult for him because his father had gone on a deployment or off to training at the same time, so he had to deploy. He moved from his school to North Carolina and was dealing with some bullying and some culture changes for himself. So I stayed on the phone with him pretty regularly because it was a tough time for him back home.
I see.
Yeah.
Do you feel it helped you get through what you were going through
yes.
in Iraq?
Hearing his voice was music. And I couldn't wait to get back to him. Yeah, it definitely helped. I needed to stay in touch with him and with my parents, and having that direct line, just picking up the phone and dialing a few numbers, being able to speak to anybody back home was wonderful. And for the people who didn't have that, I feel spoiled, and I wish that they did. I wish that they had that.
Yeah.
I was very fortunate. But the bombing almost on a daily basis was scary. It was. You never knew how close they were going to get. And there were times where we were hit and the floor would jump, and whew, that was pretty close. That's pretty close. And again, the sense of, what are we doing here? We worked with a lot of local nationals. They worked in the offices with us. And sometimes you got the sense that they weren't really, pleased about us being in their country either. So I hope what we did there was a good thing. At that time, I really didn't have a big picture. I didn't have big picture thoughts or a big picture feeling about it. I just kind of did the day-to-day. What do I need to do? What's my job? What can I do? Again, like before, what can I do to get these things bought to make things better for our forces over there and for the friendly forces that were working with us?
Right.
And so I kept it a little bit more tactical than the strategic view of it.
So you come back home
I come back
after
home.
a year,
Yes.
see your family again.
Yes.
Where are you still stationed there in Boston at this point?
Yes. Yep. Oh, actually, yeah, I came back to Boston. Because I came home in 2009, in May of 2009, and by February of 2010, I was on a plane again to Afghanistan this time.
Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Okay.
So when I came home, I got married to the man that I met in Baghdad, and then he deployed to Qatar right after we got married, and then shortly after that I deployed to Afghanistan, to Kabul. So in contracting in the Air Force at the time, we were on a 6-month rotation, but it ended up being that we were gone a little longer than that because we had to go to combat skills training first. So we would be home for 6 months, and then we would deploy for about 8 to 9 months. So I was gone again, and this time my son had to go to Ohio. So the first time I was in Iraq, he went to North Carolina, and then he went to another sister's house in Ohio. But yeah, so I was on my way to Afghanistan, February 2010, Kabul.
Did you find there's very much difference between Iraq and Afghanistan as far as
Yes.
it pertained to your job and the effects, or was it just the environment?
So ironically, I was a lot, and maybe this had to do with the training that I had prior. I went to Fort Dix for training for Afghanistan, and we saw a lot of videos there, and we did some more advanced training there, and I was a little bit more hyped up about it. And so when I arrived in Afghanistan, and because it was more austere looking there, from getting from Kabul airport, from Kia to Camp Phoenix, it was a lot scarier looking. It was more like what I saw in the videos. So I was more afraid being in Afghanistan of dying. But we didn't get bombed nearly as much. But I was still more afraid coming and going. Getting there and getting out of Afghanistan was a lot scarier for me. I think for me, it has something to do with the way that people looked at us coming down the street. I'm a big feeler, and I just felt something different in Afghanistan. Even sitting in the dining facility when the local forces would come in, the Afghani forces that we were working, shona bashona is what they called it, shoulder by shoulder with. Something about the way that they would look at me made me feel very uncomfortable. And I toured, once I got to Afghanistan, I toured Parwan prison, and listening to some of the prisoners, the way that they would talk to us as we toured through there too was a little bit unreal. The job in Afghanistan, I purchased commodities and some construction there towards the end. That was the heaviest workload I've ever had. It was never ending, never ending. The office was filled, it was an Army deployment, but the office was filled with Air Force, again, just because of the training that we get. Let's see. Afghanistan. I ended up being medevac from Kabul to Bagram. I was having some trouble with the malaria medication that they had us taking. So I got very sick while I was there. Quarantined for a while too. The workload, again, it's just the workload. Thank goodness I was there with my Air Force team because they kind of kept it funny. We would have Nerf war fights at 5 o'clock every day. You would just hear the guns going off, you know, in the office. And I did get shot while I was in Afghanistan in the eyeball with a Nerf bullet. I think that Afghanistan, to be honest with you, Afghanistan and then my final deployment, which we'll talk about too, Iraq, those were the two deployments that gave me a little bit of, you know, what people describe as PTSD. Just because of the frequencies of the deployments, I was just getting tired of it. I needed a break.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah. So I left Afghanistan in September of 2009. I moved to Ohio a week after. So I went back to Boston. But before I left Afghanistan, I got my orders to Ohio. And then on the heels of my orders to Ohio, I got my orders to Iraq. So before I even set foot in Ohio, I knew that months after I got to Ohio, I was going to be leaving for Iraq again. So I didn't even leave a deployment before I had orders to my next deployment, which meant I would be going to combat skills training again, which meant that I would be leaving my son again. So got to Ohio, did a little bit of contracting in an office called the Simulators Division. But I was gearing up for my next deployment, this time with my husband. We were going to the same location. We were going to Iraq in Camp Victory, Iraq, 2011.
Wow.
It's all kind of a blur. So Iraq, Afghanistan, Iraq.
Sure.
And you know, a divorce and a marriage and kids moving and then blending of families. And so, okay, so flash forward, I'm in Iraq, May of 2011, and we are getting bombed daily. Daily.
No, these bombs, is it mortar attacks?
Mortar attacks.
Okay.
Yeah. And I remember walking around the man-made lakes around Afal Palace and the other smaller palaces right there at Camp Victory with my husband late at night, because we would get off of work at 10, 11 o'clock, and we would walk around these palaces, and the mortars would come in, and then you'd see, it's like Star Wars, these little, you know, pinkish, purplish, reddish colors just going through the sky, doosh, 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 you know, that were intercepting the mortars, and then boom, and of course, you know, my husband wouldn't let me drop to the ground because you're supposed to, and you know, keep your mouth open and cover your ears and close your eyes, and he'd just, you know, hold my arm, stop it, you know, if this is for you, it's your time. And I remember Toto came in concert there, and we got bombed during that concert, and everybody got underneath the bleachers, and I felt so bad for the band members. Because they were terrified, you know. At this point, we're like, oh, here we go again. Yes, I felt really bad for that. It got so bad there towards the end because we were shutting down all the outlying bases. And it made it look, you know, they were bombing these little outlying bases heavily as we were shutting them down. So it made it look like they were bombing us out of there. But actually, they were just receiving intel that we were leaving. So they were bombing, and then they would, as we left those bases, they would kind of run them over and steal everything that they could from the bases. I had the security contracts in Iraq and many of the outlying bases, so all of the security towers, all the security forces, the PSD, personal security, the teams, the PSTs, and I handed everything over to the Department of State before we left and before we shut Victory down and we moved to Al-Assad. So that's what my job was there, security contracts.
Okay.
About a little over $1 billion worth of security contracts.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Now, due to the fact that you had deployment after deployment, the similarities, I mean, I know there was great differences, but just the similarities and the fact that they're one right after another, did you find yourself becoming numb to a lot of the things that initially scared you or initially,
Yeah.
I don't know what's the word, like made you, either made you fearful or sad or anything else? I mean, did you just find yourself becoming numb?
Yeah, absolutely. So we would play volleyball Friday nights, our office would, and most times we'd end up, you know, facing the dirt because we'd get bombed. But it got to the point where it was like, man, it was almost my serve. And you'd think, I hope we have enough time, you know, once they do the all clear, you know, that I can get up and I can serve again. Or you know, one of the last couple of nights, I remember that day we were bombed 19 times. And every time we were bombed, we would have to, you know, account for everybody. We'd have to do an accountability. You know, after the all clear, is everybody there? And when you're trying to sleep, because you're working long days, you know, you're starting work at 7 o'clock in the morning, you're not finishing until 10, 11 o'clock at night, and sleep is precious. You're trying to, and you're working 7.5 days a week, or not 7.5, 6.5 days a week. And so you're just trying to get some sleep. So you're like, oh, there go the alarms again. And you have to get dressed, and you have to go out there and account for yourself. So yes, you do. You become numb. You hope that their aim stays really bad. Yeah, so to answer your question, sure, you get a little irritated, you end up getting a little numb to it. What I noticed when all of the deployments were over, so I came back in 2011, and in 2012, somebody called me from headquarters and said, hey, Danita, they're looking at you again, this time back to Afghanistan. And I was at the point where I was eligible for retirement. I just started laughing. And I said, absolutely not, I'm dropping my papers. So I dropped my retirement papers on the first day that I was eligible to. And so I was out of the running for any more deployments. What I started noticing after that was dreams. And many times my husband would have to shake me to wake me up. Yeah. Where I would just start saying out loud, you can't send me again. I've applied for retirement. I'm not going again. So it wasn't dreams about being bombed. It wasn't scary dreams like that, it was panic that they were going to send me again. And so often, at least 3 times a week, I would have dreams about either going or coming back and missing my plane or not packing my stuff fast enough to get on the plane to come home. As a matter of fact, not last night, the night before.
Same thing.
I dreamt about my roommate, Nancy. She and I, we were trying to get back from Qatar, which is just a stopover spot. And I remember that, that my wall locker was still just filled with stuff, and I thought, do I really need that when I get back? So I still have those dreams. Sounds, generators, that still make my heart race a little bit. Every deployment you go on, there's just generators everywhere, for power. Yeah. Certain smells. Jersey barriers make my heart rate go up. There's a lot of T-walls and Jersey barriers.
Sure.
Over in the desert. And desert sceneries. I visited my sister in Colorado and wasn't expecting where she lived in Aurora, Colorado to look the way it did, and it just reminded me of Iraq. Construction sites remind me of the deserts. C-17s, C-5s, different aircraft still make me a little bit anxious. Yeah.
Carriers.
Loud noises. Just the other night at the gym, I work as a personal trainer now. Somebody came up behind me. Hey! And I jump, I'm like, be careful.
Right, yeah. That's.
I don't think that ever really, I don't know if it'll ever really go away. Yeah, and then of course we'll never get that time back.
Sure.
When you put all of that time together, it was years that I spent away from my family and from my son. And all of those deployments changed me and changed my relationships. And I really think that a lot of the marriage and divorce that I went through in my life was attributed to deployments. So.
Let's talk about what you do now.
Sure.
You're currently working out at Wright-Patterson
I
Air
am.
Force Base.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do there?
So I work in the C-17 division. I'm an acquisition manager. I work for a defense contractor, and I'm doing risk management for the capabilities branch for 7 different efforts that we're doing to upgrade the C-17.
That's really good. Are you actively involved in any veteran organizations?
I actually am not.
Okay.
I'm not. But I do, like I said, I work as a personal trainer in the evenings, and I have about 6 military clients that I work with. And of course, a lot of my family and a lot of my friends are veterans. And the military is my family.
Yeah.
So organizations, no, because the military is just kind of my life. They're my family. They always will be. They always have been since the day I was born.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
I suppose I should get more involved, right? Somebody told me about Team Red, White, and Blue, or Red, I think it's Red, White, and Blue. They run in marathons.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I do the Air Force Marathon every year, the half.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, just to kind of wrap things up here. Well, first, I'm sorry, before that.
Sure.
Let's talk about, real quick, what kind of things that you do, how your interaction is, like, after all your deployments and everything like that. Now that you're home with your family and everything like that, how does it feel now that you're home, now that you don't have to worry about deployments and all that, that you're you've retired from the Air Force? Do you have a sense of, is that aside from the dreams, I know we
Sure.
talked about the dreams, but aside from that, do you feel like you have time now to kind of re-engage or get involved or make up for lost time, maybe?
So I will definitely answer your question, but before I get to that, I do want to say, because I pointed out a lot of the difficulties that I experienced in the Air Force. But here's the thing: bottom line is, I'd do it all over again in a heartbeat. I think the only thing that I would change is I would have joined sooner. I loved being in the Air Force, every single solitary minute of it, and I am so grateful and thankful for the training I received, the educational opportunities. The moving around that I got to do, from Texas to DC to South Carolina, the people that I met along the way, that I was able to serve at the same time with my little sister and my brother and my brother-in-law, and I'm even so grateful for the deployments, because I grew, and I met amazing people over there, and I did incredible things. So I wouldn't change a thing. Did I miss my son? Absolutely. Can I get that time back? No. Have I been able to make up for lost time? Oh, I hope so. We have a great relationship today, and I look forward to many more incredible moments with him. He is a great kid. Got himself through all of the he went to 13 different schools because of me being in the military, but he still nailed a full academic scholarship to the university that we're sitting in today. And I know he has an incredibly bright future. He is the most incredible person I've met in my whole life. And I'd like to think that what he experienced growing up and having me as his mom had something to do with that. So
Absolutely.
my family sees me today as somebody that has achieved a lot, that was goal-oriented, driven, a hard worker, that maybe lost herself for a while through those deployments, primarily between the years of 2007 until 2011. But I've reemerged. My identity is not wrapped in the military. It never has been. My identity is truly wrapped in my faith, my family, and my friends. I am happy, I feel whole, and just grateful. And I'm so happy to be working with the Air Force again, alongside them. So
That's great.
I think I'm doing good now. And I'm grateful for the past, and I'm so tremendously grateful for the Air Force. And I would recommend anybody who even feels a little bit leaning towards joining, that they do it, because there's nothing quite like serving your country. It is, when you see your name on that tape, on your uniform, it just fills you with this incredible feeling.
Wow.
Yeah. And thank you for
Wow.
giving me the opportunity to
No.
talk about it. This is the
Yeah.
first time. I served for, almost 22 years, and it's the first time I got to really talk in depth about it. So thank you.
It's an amazing story.
Thank you.
It is amazing. Well, this concludes our interview. I think that was a beautiful summary.
Oh,
So,
thank you.
thank you for your story.
Yeah, absolutely.
And thank you for your service.
My pleasure.